Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. On this week's podcast, Marina Nitze, author of Hack Your Bureaucracy and a pioneer behind the Child Welfare Playbook, joins us to talk about meaningful problem-solving processes and solutions in child welfare and why she is optimistic about the odds of improving the support of kinship caregivers in America. Before we get to that, let's do some headlines, and we will dwell this week in national and federal stuff, starting with the massive $1.7 trillion omnibus spending agreement reached just before the holidays and signed into law by President Biden. It's worth noting before we get into that, though, that for next year, while nobody really loves the idea of glomming these huge spending bills together at the last minute, which really become the custom in Washington, this super crazy 15-vote process to select a Speaker of the House involves some rule changes that will make that sort of thing, pursuing, a big end-of-year package to get things done, much harder to achieve for fiscal year 2024. It's also going to move to a cut-go process in the House, where the House of Representatives basically can't even consider anything that has the net effect of increasing mandatory federal spending in a 5 to 10 year window. So, the idea of all these rules that now Speaker McCarthy had to agree to is to get the appropriations process back to a more normal order, maybe. But in reality, because the Senate is not going to be limiting itself in any way, what it really does is greatly increase the odds of a government shutdown or a pretty chaotic budget process next year. But anyway, this year's spending bill includes some noteworthy spending increases and policy changes. I'm going to link to our rundown of this from the Imprint, which includes our annual full line-by-line chart of youth and family spending. But here are just a few of the standout things from this spending deal as pertains to, child welfare and youth justice. First of all, the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program, which we had Jenny Harper on, I think, in October to talk about the reauthorization process for. There was a reauthorization of this program put into the spending deal. If you've never heard of home visiting, generally this is a program, there's many models of doing this, but that pair trained professionals with new and expecting parents to support them both during pregnancy and after. This was a $400 million per year line under this reauthorization. That gets bumped up to $500 million and actually could be as high as $800 million in following years, depending on sort of a match program that we came up with. So basically, if states are willing to go above and beyond and actually match federal money, they can get their allotment of the $500 million, which I'm assuming is kind of based on child population. And then they can get even more by matching what the feds are willing to put in, up to this $300 million extra pot that's created under the reauthorization. Second, there were included in this spending bill some notable shifts in Medicaid policy when it comes to youth who are incarcerated. And these changes, I'll just explain very kind of superficially in our kind of deep dive. If you want to go and read that, it has a little more detail, but these would take effect in 2024. So there's really two changes that are made. First, for youth who are detained before they're sentenced by a judge, so if they're putting it into a detention center, states will now be able to opt to provide Medicaid throughout that period before disposition. Now, just to back up a step here, Generally, there are rules that prevent Medicaid from being used to support the healthcare costs of anybody who's incarcerated, including youth. Now, technically, states have always had the ability to pursue permission to use Medicaid for youth who are in a detention facility. So that they are incarcerated. They haven't actually been convicted of anything. They are waiting to have a disposition from a judge. And I know that because years ago I wrote about Bernalillo County in New Mexico, which had, basically gone and secured clarity and permission to do so with its own juvenile detention center in Bernalillo County, which I believe covers Albuquerque and I think also Santa Fe. So the ability has always kind of been there. Probably states or counties felt like they needed to get permission if they were ever going to use it. And I think there was generally just an assumption on a lot of parts. If I'm going back more than a decade in reporting on this, generally just an assumption that, detention centers would just fall in line with the incarceration limits on Medicaid in every other circumstance. So that's one. In detention centers, states will now be able to, the way that's described in the budget deal, opt in to provide Medicaid and keep Medicaid going for youth who are in detention, which is significant. I mean, there are a lot of youth who end up being detained before disposition for months. So the second change to Medicaid policy is that states will actually be required. So this is not an option. States will be required to provide certain Medicaid or children's health insurance program services to eligible youth in preparation for and after their release from an institution. And that is quite a departure from the overall blockade against using Medicaid for incarcerated youth, because this is basically saying, to some extent, you actually have to, as you prepare for a youth to be released from an incarceration setting, turn the Medicaid back on if it's been suspended, and prepare by doing screenings and diagnostic services for the 30 days before release, and then also actually targeted case management and referrals for 30 days after. So I think the proof will be in the pudding. Obviously, this is a change on the federal level, and it really just depends on who's keeping an eye on this and whether states will actually comply and be doing this. But it is a pretty significant easement of the kind of strict barring off of Medicaid services for youth who are in an incarceration setting. One big spending increase worth keeping an eye on here as we eye the trends in federal spending: full service community schools. Now, this is a model that, if history serves me, really was kind of born out of the New York City mid-1990s, early 90s, kind of incubated by Richard Murphy and Jeffrey Canada, first at the Reedland Center and then with the Harlem Children's Zone. This is the concept of basically viewing the school as a place that can be used all day long for community-oriented things that can promote youth development, family wellness, all the things. And so this was a kind of small line in the budget as recently as 2020. I think it got $30 million in 2020. That popped up to $75 million in 2021. Now, the president in his 2023 budget request asked for, I think, $470 million. So that would really have put the full service community schools program on steroids. It didn't get quite nearly that much, but it did get $150 million this year. So that is a doubling of its appropriation in 2022. We'll see if it keeps that trajectory. It's very similar to what's happened to the apprenticeship program, right? That is a popular line. President Trump always asked for an increase in that. Senator Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota has been an advocate of boosting up the apprenticeship line for job training opportunities for youth and young adults. That was $68 million before Trump took office in 2016. That's up to $285 million. So every once in a while, there's just this one spending line in the Department of Labor or Justice or HHS that just sort of gets popular with both sides. And once you have some buy-in from both parties, you can really see, appropriations escalate. We'll see if that's true next year, though. So again, I'll post for anybody that wants to read a little bit more about our budget analysis for this year, the spending deal analysis, along with just our handy chart, if you want to just look at all the different lines. The Biden administration is planning to initiate a study on equity in child welfare that I think, if I'm reading it right, could unearth some really valuable information It's called the Child Welfare Study to Enhance Equity with Data, to acronyms out to CWSEED. Everything has to have an acronym. Here is what they are planning. So the idea is to use an analysis of 6 systems, which probably will be a mix of state, county, and city systems, to see, and I'm quoting here from the description in the Federal Register of the plan, to what extent data are used to explore equity in service delivery and child and family outcomes, to identify barriers or problematic data practices, and to explore efforts by child welfare agencies and their partners to use data to reduce barriers across the continuum of child welfare services. So in one sense, it looks like it's going to be a study about studying. The goal here is to look at these systems and see how, or if they even are, using data to review how different families are experiencing the system and what the outcomes are. So the goal here is just to establish whether anybody is calibrating what they're doing based on trends and looking back and assessing things, and perhaps also kind of identifying what good data systems look like for all this and where there are, significant barriers across this stuff. But why this matters, if I'm reading it all right, is that we have some very sharp knowledge of how disproportionality and inequity exists at the front end of the child welfare system, right? There's way more Black and Native American families who are investigated for alleged abuse and neglect. And then on the back end, we know that in many states, those two groups experience far more foster care and more terminations of parental rights. But this is like a first drill down attempt into the middle of that sandwich, because we know that most investigations do not lead to a case, and most cases do not involve foster care. And it's that middle where there's really not as much known. So like most critically, are white parents more likely to receive various supports instead of foster care, like housing help or substance abuse treatment, financial assistance, getting those things from the child welfare system? Are they more likely to get it more than once before foster care is used? That's the sort of thing that really is not well known by what we gauge in federal data or even state data, honestly, in almost every system. And it's a timely effort to do this because, in 2018, the Family First Prevention Services Act was signed into law. This is a bill that opened up the child welfare entitlement to include not only foster care and adoption money for states, but also funds to prevent the use of foster care in at least some child welfare cases. Now, we had my friend Corey Best on this podcast, I believe in late 2021. During his interview with us, he voiced some concern that the services that are offered up as prevention in the Family First Act might redound far more to white parents than they would to Black parents or other parents who are involved in the child welfare system. And that's a fair concern. You're not going to know that unless there is some way to assess through data whether services like the ones prescribed in Family First and other intervention services that child welfare service programs are rendering are being distributed evenly or equitably within the system to different parents. Speaking of the Family First Act, after a lengthy wait, the Senate has confirmed President Joe Biden's choice for one of the top jobs in the federal child welfare policy matrix, and that is Rebecca Jones-Gaston, who has finally been confirmed by the Senate to lead the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, which is the acronym, the ACYF. So just a very super quick primer here on the Kachina doll that is child welfare leadership in the federal government. There's the Administration for Children and Families. That's the big division of the Department of Health and Human Services, where most family services in general and all of child welfare policy is really set. Within the ACF matrix, there is this Administration on Children, Youth, and Families that Rebecca Jones-Gaston will now lead. And there are two divisions of that. One is the Children's Bureau, which most people associate with child welfare policy, and that's been run by Asia Schomburg for quite a while now. I think she was one of the earliest appointees for child welfare in the Biden administration. And the other side of ACYF is the Family and Youth Services Bureau, which handles a couple of catch-all things, including, runaway and homeless youth services, sexual health and adolescent pregnancy prevention, things like that. So why did I start this by saying, speaking of the Family First Act, Jones-Gaston, who is a person with lived experience in this system, she was adopted from foster care, has also led 2 state child welfare systems in her time. One was Maryland. She left Maryland to lead Oregon. Both of those states were among the first to get approval to tap into the federal prevention of foster care funds within the Family First Act. So my expectation, I don't think anybody's really set this out in writing anywhere, is that Gaston's portfolio in the Biden administration will definitely be, to some extent, figuring out how to get more states signed up, essentially, and actually using the 4E money for preventing foster care under the Family First Act. Because I think there's certainly been some angst about both how many programs and models and allowable services are even approved by the clearinghouse for the Family First Act, and how slow some states, or really most states, have been in kind of like actually getting in line with getting approved for and then really starting to tap into the money. Last thing for this week, I want to mention to folks that our Who Cares project, which is the Imprint's annual data collection around foster care capacity and several other indicators within the child welfare system, has been updated with our state collected data as of December. We just put up a fresh round of 2022 data. So basically, for anybody that hasn't used this yet, if you go to fostercarecapacity.org, that is where we house the Who Cares project. This sort of began in 2017 as a one-off white paper that we wanted to do, because while the federal report called the AFCARS report every year puts out some helpful top-line information about the number of kids who are in foster care and their demographic breakdown, how long they've been, things like that, there really has never been a kind of annually collected, publicly viewable resource for answering the questions like how many licensed foster homes are there in each state and how many congregate care providers are in each state, things like that. So over the time, we've kind of added some questions, put this all together into this website, fostercarecapacity.org. And you can go to that to check out some national data sets. Each state has its own state profile. It's really pretty good. And we combine our state collected data with some AFCAR specialty data, working with a researcher. We just use the most recent years. So we've updated with 2022 data from our end. The AFCAR's 2021 numbers will soon be available, I think, for kind of the more robust, data that they collect. And we'll add that as soon as we can. But just speaking to what we collect directly from states, we ask them for the total number of licensed homes as of March 31st of whatever year we're collecting for. So this is the March 31st, 2022 numbers that we put out in December. How many of those are non-relative homes? We ask for the number of active relatives with a placement. We ask them to tell us the number of congregate care providers. And because federal data on the number of youth in care tends to lag by a year and a half or so, we ask for a point-in-time count, March 31st, of the youth in their foster care systems. So you can go to fostercarecapacity.org to see all that. I'll just give you a couple of findings from this year's numbers. You may remember we talked about this towards the end of last year, that the federal AFCARS report for 2021 showed that the number of youth in foster care had declined below the 400,000 mark for the first time since 2012. There were 391,098 youth in foster care per the federal 2021 AFCARS report. Now, based on the Imprint's 2022 collection for the Who Cares project, which I will just concede at the outset is definitely not apples to apples. There's no guarantee that I'm getting the exact precise number that the feds would get from them. This gradual decline in foster care that began in 2018 and continued in 2021 based on federal data continued into 2022. So we collect with a point in time, again, of March 31st, that there were 381,176 youth in foster care around that time. And we had to use a projection for South Dakota, who was not able to come up with a number that kind of fit our criteria. But every other state had a response to us. So that's good news. There's less youth in foster care for, I think, 5 straight years now. On the foster home side, the number of licensed foster homes in America has declined. This is now several years in a row. And in this case, we had to use a projection for Texas, but every other state responded. there were 208,824 licensed homes in the country as of March 31st, 2022. So that is down from 220,000 in 2019. But the drop is actually slightly larger than that because we were unable to collect a total from the state of Virginia pretty much in every year we've done this project until last year. So Virginia reported 2,503 licensed homes to us for 2022. They never reported in previous years. So that you have to factor that into the totals. So if you want to see the trends and all of this stuff in the state that you care about, or if you want to see some of the national sets, again, shameless plug, go to fostercarecapacity.org. You can check it all out there. All right, when we come back, our interview with Marina Nitze.
This episode is sponsored by Creating a Family. Creating a Family is a national nonprofit whose mission is to strengthen and inspire adoptive, foster, and kinship parents and the professionals who support them in raising children exposed to trauma. Creating a Family offers expert-based and trauma-informed resources and training for parents and professionals. To learn more, visit creatingafamily.org. That's creatingafamily.org.
We are joined today by Marina Nitze, who I honestly don't know how to describe. She's like the unseen hand behind change in foster care. I can say for sure she's the co-author of the recently released book, Hack Your Bureaucracy, and the pioneer, or one of them, behind the Child Welfare Playbook, which we'll talk about at length. So Marina, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Podcast rules, you got to let these folks know a little something about you before we get started talking about wonky policy stuff. Give me a couple of favorites. Your categories are sports team, book, musical group, TV show, or movie. Can give me more than one, but you got to give me one. What do you got, Marina?
Yeah, my favorite movie is definitely Closer. It was originally a play by Patrick Marber, and then it became a movie with four people. It was Julia Roberts, Natalie Portman, Clive Owen, and Jude Law. I never go to movie theaters, and I think I saw it in theaters like 8 times.
Whoa, not a fan of the movie theater experience, huh?
It's more that I just never kind of have the time. I'm always working, and movie theaters don't tend to be open at 2:00 in the morning when I'm done. So.
Oh man! So tell folks like how you actually. I am curious of this. I think I know a little bit of the backstory, but how did you come to focus your interest in this area of foster care and child welfare and all that stuff? How'd that come about?
Yeah, so I've been a court-appointed special advocate in Washington State for going on 16 years now. I started it volunteering that way in my early 20s. And I kept seeing my kids fall through just like objectively awful cracks, moving schools 2 weeks before elementary school ended and not being able to get transportation, or being removed from mom because mom had to leave them alone to work an extra shift so they wouldn't get evicted. And then we, remove the kids, create intergenerational trauma, and then give the foster parents daycare stipend. So what if we had just given that to mom? I kept seeing that happen, but I wasn't quite sure what to do about it. And then through some other life circumstances, I ended up working in the federal government. I joined the first class of Presidential Innovation Fellows, where I worked at the Department of Education. And then I became the Chief Technology Officer for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And that's about the equivalent of a Fortune 10 company. So I learned a lot about bureaucracies, how things work, made a lot of mistakes, learned, thankfully, from a lot of really amazing mentors. But I was a political appointee. So when President Obama left, I knew I had to leave that same day. And I knew I wanted to do something in child welfare. And so I kept telling people, hey, I think I have a skill set now that might be useful. How might I use this? And my original boss when I was at the Department of Education, Richard Kulata, had gone on to be the Chief Innovation Officer for the state of Rhode Island. And he was like, hey, we have a foster care, challenges. Why don't you come here and talk to us for a bit? And I got to meet the team there. We talked about some projects. And
this is like all informal at this point.
Yeah,
just like
absolutely.
Come hang out, have coffee, and like probably a Dunkin' Donuts since it's Rhode Island. Yeah,
absolutely. And that was really eye-opening, because something that I learned at the VA very early is the value of sitting down with your real users and talking with them, over coffee or wherever that may be. And at the time, Rhode Island was really struggling with recruitment, and they thought, maybe there's like a technology solution here, which is, I think, a thing states think a lot. Maybe we can use technology to manufacture new foster parents. And I suggested, what if we sit down with some families that have dropped out of becoming foster parents and understand where they went, right? Because this was a group that was seemingly motivated. It turned out the majority of them were like, hey, I would call to check on how many training hours I had left. Nobody knew, and nobody called me back. And if you're treating me like that when you're recruiting me, how exactly is this going to work? when I have a kid in my home experiencing a crisis. So I'm out. And Rhode Island did some really heroic work around fixing that. Started with a spreadsheet, moved on to some more complicated things. I just love that team. They're so great. From that, it's grown. I now run a 21 state, hopefully soon to be a little bit larger, working group called the Resource Family Working Group. Every month we meet and talk about a very specific topic. It might be how you use social media for kin finding or how you run background checks for foster parents. And we surface and scale promising practices from different states. We solve group challenges. And then we publish all the promising practices we find on the playbook, which is childwelfareplaybook.com. And the idea there is that states find it easier to go second. So whenever I find a state that's gone first or is in a position to go first on something, we help them set that up. And then we make it really, really easy for other states to copy that practice, whether it's a seemingly simple practice change to a form change to sometimes even legislative change.
This is a master class in public speaking. You just took us from the original question all the way to what you're doing now. So we'll get back to the playbook because I do have a bunch of questions for you on that. But I just something you said about the recruitment issues that Rhode Island had that I think are probably, pretty applicable to a lot of states, that I just think gets lost in the shuffle is it's kind of always framed as a recruitment problem when I think retention is almost, it's like there's recruitment and retention, but I almost think the retention is the problem with the recruitment. To some extent, and that we're finding. I mean, I feel like we've found that out a little bit over the last several years, trying to draw this information out of states every year about like how many licensed caregivers do you have? And the numbers that we kind of got in, I started to think like, this is not that, when you just do it as sort of a ratio of those homes to like how many kids there are, it's not this like enormous gap, but obviously there's some particular demographics within foster care that are challenging. But it's really more like the research that, like Fred Wolchin and his team have done has clearly showed like you get these families in the door and like a year later, you've lost half. And then by 5 years, you've lost almost all of them in some cases. I don't know. Has your group and has Rhode Island kind of gotten to that and like figured out?
Yeah, we're doing a lot of thoughts and work around retention. So I think you're right that retention is a huge problem. And it's one that's hard to see because everybody's focused on the front door. In the states where I have seen data, the number of foster parents may have seemed relatively constant over time, but the experience level of the foster parents is falling through the floor.
Oh,
so you're losing the families that, have been around for 10 or 15 years. And not only do those families tend to be better suited to help our kiddos with higher levels of need, but they're also a form of recruitment themselves because they'll tell friends and family and people will, interact with them in the community. And when you lose them, they are a reverse form of recruitment because people are like, oh, why'd you stop fostering? And then they tell that story to the community. And the smaller your community is, whether you're maybe a county administered system or you're a smaller state, I think that can be especially painful. And part of that of the loop is really when states don't have enough of the families that kids really need, we burn those families out. You'll be like, oh my God, John, you did so great with this kiddo. They were unified with their parents this morning at 9:00. It's now 9:30. Would you like to take two more extremely challenging kiddos? When, we should be thinking about, do you need, grief therapy, or do you just need a break? Or maybe you want to do respite for a little while, or what other ways can we support you to stay in the game?
Yeah, totally. So the CASA has been going on for a while. The Rhode Island experience was after your tenure relatively recently with the Obama administration. So a few years ago now, but I guess I'm curious, like over this span of time, how have your views evolved about the child welfare system and foster care in general? I think all of it as you've met more people and accumulated more personal knowledge and talked to people about their experiences.
So I think my views have changed in a couple of ways. I did not appreciate the value of kinship caregivers when I first started. I didn't even really know that I knew the concept or what the barriers were. And so much of my work now is on kinship caregivers and supporting them. So I have kind of three goals. The first one is that I think we should be placing kids with kin at least 80% of the time in this country. And we currently do it 34%. And I think it's actually not extremely hard to get there. I have a dashboard on our playbook where we collected some promising practices that I'd love to talk about maybe today that have really helped states bump their kin placement rates up significantly. With almost no exception, they're all free. You don't require legal changes, they're practice changes to implement. And I think something that we as a country are doing very, very poorly that we could do much, much better. So place kids with kin 80% of the time. of the kinship caregivers right now as a country, and you and I have talked about this, we don't really have great data on how many of those kinship caregivers we're paying, which is crazy, even though they have kids in their home and they are multiple times more likely to live below the poverty line. And I think we should pay 100% of them. And then for the kids that truly don't have a kinship caregiver, which again, I think is a much smaller population than we believe, I think we should use data and modern recruitment practices to recruit and retain the kind of families that those kids actually need. Families that live in their school district, that share their culture, that speak their language, that can take their entire sibling group. And we're doing some pretty exciting projects around that space as well. Kids are not widgets. That's probably not news to anybody listening to this, but you can't say like, oh, we have 3,000 open beds. That is a totally meaningless number. I think that this works when you get really hyper local and you say, okay, on average, you've got 2 sibling groups of 3 that speak Vietnamese in BFJ Elementary School District. How many families like that do we have? And then over time, how many of those families are we going to need in 6 months or in 12 months? And how long does it take to recruit a family like that? Probably years. So really thinking through like how you have a data-driven, I don't know that I'd say it's futuristic, but forward-looking recruitment model that really thinks about what are the families that our kids need, not just how many families saw a billboard and signed up and now,
Yeah.
you have a bed.
Yeah. On the kin aspect of it, I was at a conference down in Texas a couple of years ago, and this guy, I didn't speak to him on the record, so I won't say who it is, but he just hit me with this, observation that just kind of floored me after. And he's like, the baby boomer generation was pretty into foster care and being foster parents. And it's a huge generation. He's like, in your generation, I'm like 42, going on 43, and younger are not right now participating in foster parenting like that generation did. And you guys would need to foster at 3 times the rate that they did just to be even. So like once you kind of absorb that, it's like, it's not a matter of like, you should get to 80% or some very high ratio of kin. You're going to have to, like, unless you just want to totally warehouse kids in group homes and institutions, it's coming, like we're probably not there yet with that shortfall, but I do feel like he's kind of right. Like that's probably coming, where we're going to see this big drop. It's going to be harder to recruit foster parents because there's just less adults in the age range, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely part of it. And I think also hard, and this is something I really learned at the VA as well, many people that are outside of child welfare don't really understand how the whole process works. And I think, Chapin Hall's research around mandated reporters is also really interesting. I think there are a lot of, if we're going to be positive about this, there are a lot of teachers or emergency room doctors or whomever who are seeing maybe a family struggling with housing, and they think that calling the child abuse hotline will result in that family getting help, when it will result in that family being harmed. And we have set it up so that they feel they're legally required to call that in, right, and harm that family. And that's creating these tremendous downstream impacts that we could stop upstream by helping preserve families in place.
Yes, I guess that is the other way to address what's coming in terms of shortfall, is to just not take as many kids into foster care.
Well, I think you need
better one.
both. Yeah, I think you need both.
Yeah.
We should have way fewer kids should be in foster care today. Foster care is not a safe place for children. It is not a nurturing place for children. Children should not be in foster care. If we can keep them out, that would be my priority number one. Although it's not the area where I work. Where I work starts at, if a child is in care, how do we get them with kin? How do we fully resource that kin on par with a stranger foster parent? Or how do we truly find that foster parent that a child who doesn't have a kinship caregiver may need?
So you're kind of bullish, we've talked about this in the past, on the proposed rule that the administration put out on this, which I think is still not finalized, about basically permitting states to create a differentiation between what licensing means for a non-relative, your typical resource parent, and a kinship caregiver. I'll tell you why I'm a little wary, but of it. It's a good policy, but I'll tell you why I'm wary. But I'm curious what you would do with that as somebody who would want to kind of weaponize is a stupid word, but actionize that once it comes out. So
anybody that hasn't read it, they're only at the point of a notice of proposed rulemaking that came out, I think, in November. The idea being that right now, I'm sure everybody listening to this has read the Social Security Act around foster care maintenance payments and how to define foster family homes. But the idea is that a foster family home is one that is licensed or approved And the word or has been interpreted to be the word and in child welfare. So licensed and approved are the same thing instead of being different things. Right now, most states have an emergency placement process for kin, and that involves a background check that meets federal requirements and usually a safety walkthrough that's usually for more like amelioration, like, oh, you're taking in a toddler and you don't have a car seat, here's a car seat. They will place with relatives just doing those two steps, and they will leave that child there for years indefinitely. But if that family wants to get paid, they have to go through a Byzantine licensing paperwork process that involves, in many cases, proving they have recycling, registering their dog, providing, their vehicle insurance every month. It's a very, very classist, racist, problematic process almost everywhere. And I think what was better and fair for families is that emergency approval process should be the approval process under federal rule to get your foster care maintenance payment. So if you're approved, if you're safe enough to place, you should be safe enough to pay. And the fact that we add all this paperwork in the middle is like a deeply inequitable harm that we are causing to our kinship caregivers, who are already multiple times more likely to live below the poverty line. But I'd love to hear, what's your perspective?
Oh, that's a good slogan. First off, if you're safe enough to place, you're safe enough to pay. I could see that on memes and things, right?
It's more complicated than that, but that's alliterative. So.
I know. Well, first, I think in your mind, do you think it's accurate to say that policy sort of, I think, tries to almost codify the circuit court around me? I'm in Michigan, so our circuit court had this case Glisson v. DO, where basically the ruling was, if you approve a relative, you got to treat them like a foster parent. So basically, I think this is to some extent, right, just sort of saying on a national level, this is okay for everybody to have this process. I guess where I'm wary, and again, it's not like I would say it's a bad policy or a bad idea, is like, I don't know if leadership and the bureaucracy will use it. Like DO, I don't know how many years ago, I think it was 2015 that ruling came out. There's several states in the circuit where it's pretty obviously not being enforced and implemented. I think you've got a problem where there might be an official parity between foster parents and relatives. It will still be possible for systems to place youth informally with relatives, and not so much. I do think there are some states that do that also with non-relatives in a weird way, but and so there's like this bureaucratic disincentive to even letting kin know that they could do this. Like, go get approved, go get licensed. So I guess that's not like, that's fixable. I think that's solvable. Somebody like you or some, advocates could basically just, I feel like there's going to need to be a massive know your rights campaign of some kind to make sure that kin know, because I just think there will always be this problem of like, whose interest is it to tell them about it?
And this gets tricky too, because I think there's a real open question of, let's say you are a kinship caregiver informally, the child is not in foster care.
Yeah.
I don't want that child to enter foster care for that kinship caregiver to get the resources that they may need to maintain that placement. I think there's talk, could there be some other agency or community-based supports that can help support that placement so that child never has to enter foster care? Because as we talked about, like, that's not a good trajectory. But at the same time, the concept of diverting kids to family members and then leaving them in this horrible limbo where they don't know what to do and they're not getting any supports, that's not good either. So I think there's a lot of open questions around that space. But in terms of supporting the kinship caregivers that we currently placed kids in state custody with, I think that's certainly an area to start. And it's interestingly, it's not like a partisan issue. I think the best state at this is Oklahoma right now. They have really flexible policies. They have a really dedicated staff. And within 60 days, they license, as in pay, 100% of their kinship caregivers. And if they don't do that by day 60, they use state funds to pay them until they get through the paperwork. And they have a very flexible policy that says, hey, we'll waive anything that is not, a background check felony level concern, which is a flexibility that every state has, multiple states are using, but most states are not. And that's a lot of what I try to do with my working group is surface, like, hey, you could adopt Oklahoma's policy here. And you could adopt, like, California has a great practice where they don't legally define a bedroom. So instead of saying like, oh, grandma doesn't can't meet requirements because grandma doesn't have a 200 square foot bedroom with 2 points of egress,
Yeah.
They're like, well, that, whatever, if the child is there and they're safe and they're on the couch, that counts. And that's another thing that other states could pick up rather than trying to define by points of egress and bedrooms. In Maryland, it's against state law for foster kids to sleep in bunk beds. If anyone from Maryland is listening to this, I hope you will change that law. So there's just all these bits and pieces around the country that I think we have all the puzzle pieces, and we could really put them together to do a much, much better job for kids and families.
I slept in a bunk bed for years. I only fell out one time.
Well, I definitely fell out of bunk bed as well, but that's okay. That's a rite of passage.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the Imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code podcast10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code podcast10 today.
So a few phrases from your, I've been consuming you talking about your book. And I mean, I've obviously heard you talk about some of the things you've worked with in federal government. So there's a few phrases I picked out that I was hoping you could kind of riff on how you see them apply to the child welfare landscape. So one that I think you guys kind of focus on in the book is never waste a crisis. And crisis is a super loaded word in child welfare because I think the immediate connotation is what happens when a kid dies that the system knew. But I think there's other crises, to the media's credit, that are getting focused now, like kids sleeping in offices, the circumstances of youth aging out. I think we're just better in general about paying attention to more. Sadly, there are more crises, but I think they're all getting attention. So how does the child welfare system and the people who care about these kids and families use that advice in this space?
So child welfare very much reminds me of when I worked at the VA for years. And the VA at the time, 2012 onward, we were on the front page of the newspaper every day for something very egregiously bad. Veterans dying in some way or another, veterans not getting health care. And the problem, which I think we also suffer with in child welfare, is that when you're inundated with crises at that level and that level of scrutiny all the time, it's like that analogy where you put the frog in the pot and you turn the water up and the frog boils to death. Although apparently that is not true. The frog will actually jump out of the pot. I don't know who tested that, but
whoa.
Yes, I know. And so, however, I still think there are kinds of crises that we respond to. One example that I've seen really move needles in foster care tend to be lawsuits, because they come with some sort of immediate, often like money to do something and a very specific task. And so the idea of don't waste a crisis is usually to be prepared for it. So we never know when a crisis is going to come. We are aware, as you said, there are some crises that are just ongoing fires, like kids sleeping in lobbies, that are awful and have tons of downstream effects that I don't think people really think about. But if you have an idea for a thing that you want changed and you don't quite see a path forward, the way to not waste the crisis is to get prepared for it, write the memo, figure out the budget, figure out the action plan. So when that bad day happens or that lawsuit is decided or whatever it may be, you're really well situated to move forward. A lot of states have a really great opportunity now with new gubernatorial teams, right? There were just 36 elections. To think too, it's not exactly a crisis, but it's a big transition time where everybody who has their 90-day plans and their listening tours and they want quick wins. If you have something lined up that's ready to go, I think you are potentially really well positioned to get that over the finish line in a way that you might not be in a time of calm or in a time of consistent leadership.
All right. Using bureaucracy against itself. You've been in the bureaucracy. You've tried to push bureaucracy. What does this mean for folks in this space? I'm sure they'll be interested to know. How can they do this?
This is kind of my favorite, and it's a little bit of a meta tactic. And it's the idea that people hate bureaucracy and they lament it and they want to blow it up and they want to go around it, but bureaucracies don't go away. And in the course of writing this book, we researched a lot of bureaucracies, could not find an example of any that had ever disappeared or been successfully blown up. And we actually really couldn't find examples of places that weren't bureaucracies at all. This search even led us to like a co-op grocery store in Berkeley, California. Turns out it was also a bureaucracy. And so if we accept that we're living in a bureaucracy, which is kind of step one, then it's okay. people in this bureaucracy are going to follow policies, processes, procedures. They have incentives and risks. They have performance plans, position descriptions, strategic plans. How do we write our goals and the things that we want to have happen into all of that bureaucratic cruft so that we make the least risky, highest reward path for the everyday person in that bureaucracy, the path that we want them to follow? And so, going back to our conversation a little while ago about paying kinship caregivers, it's not even about making a plea that we should pay them or making some sort of special additional side path for paying them. Fix your core policy. Go adopt Oklahoma's policy on exemptions, right? Set up an SLA that's in licensing workers' performance plans about how a timeliness for when families need to be gone through. Go through the process itself with real families, which is something that I do a lot and I think is full of opportunity. Follow real families going through the process, especially real kinship caregivers, and find all the opportunities where they're hitting barriers, not able to get through, getting stuck, and undo those things core in your process. And even if that involves, changing some state rule or administrative code, that might take years, but the thing is, it's always going to take years. So if you start now, in a few years, it will be done. And then your new process, a fair and equitable one, will be the process that everybody follows.
So do you, I'm thinking of that example of like, if I was a state leader somewhere else and I get that Oklahoma's got the right kind of mousetrap, and I want to get it into my bureaucracy, to what extent in your guys' research does bureaucracy exist or kind of defend against changes in spending? Because I guess the pessimist in me, when I heard that, was like, well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure you could have a meeting with a bunch of people and say, like, look how good they're doing. And then like the question is going to be, how much did it cost them to do that? Or how much more are they spending? And then the rest of the meeting is like, okay, well, we'll think about it,
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's going to vary a little bit on your particular agency in terms of where the incentives are. In some states, you could argue that you already have the funding in place to pay all of them. It's just because if you think about it, there's nothing from a budgetary perspective that's stopping all those families from getting licensed. You didn't budget that 10% of them would get licensed. In theory, they could all get licensed and paid. Mm-hmm. There could be an argument there. There could be a downstream cost avoidance argument. Even I've seen some creative ones around headcount. Every child welfare agency right now is struggling with hiring. If your agency is one, and this is a common number I've heard, that can do 1 or 2 licenses a month per worker, and then you switch to saying, hey, but relative approvals is this much faster, streamlined process that you're doing anyway, that starts really shifting your headcount around, and you might actually have more workers you can take off of licensing and put onto real families and actually helping them. Some states have been working on kind of creative side things around child-specific licenses or provisional whatevers. So they're going after the money. They're just going after it, I think, in a more complicated way. So this could be simplified. And if anybody's listening here and wants to strategize, I'd be happy to hop on a Zoom with you and think through different paths forward.
Last one, and then we'll get to the mechanism through which you do that frequently. But between the silos, I heard you talk about some of your work at the VA, I think around like how you guys kind of figured out problems with like the disability claims process, which I'm sure is a nightmare or was there. It's an interesting concept because silo is like one of the most frequently used words in like the child welfare policy speak. But where do you see this concept existing? If I understood you right in this talk, it's like, maybe the problem of braiding silos isn't so scary. There's just a gap between them you have to like technologically bridge or something like that. Yeah.
This is one of my favorite tactics. I do it all the time. And it's one that anybody can really pick up and do. So the larger or the older your institution, the more siloed it is. I think we're all pretty familiar with that concept. And siloed steps or teams get really defensive about change. Like sometimes it's almost like they've got a sentry posted out front. It's like, don't come in here, like stay far away. But the handoff in between steps is usually completely unguarded, and not just unguarded, but often nobody even knows how it works. Because, I tell people all the time, a lot of these processes were never designed in the first place. They are harming people, but they weren't designed to harm people as much as they were never designed in the first place. Nobody owns this end-to-end process. And actually, my favorite story to tell on this topic is from child welfare. I was in a particular state, and I was following a real foster parent application from start to finish with the goal of finding efficiencies, removing barriers for kinship caregivers. And so I'm sitting down with a woman, and she's like, okay, well, now I have to request the applicant's driving record. And she takes out a carbon copy form, the form where you press really hard through the 3 colors.
Yes.
And she's complaining the whole time. Oh my God, Marina, the DMV, they live in the 19th century. They're making me fill out this carbon copy form. I have to find a stamp. Who even has stamps? Like, I hate this part of my job the most. And I did what this woman was not empowered to do, which was I then went to the DMV and I said, hey, could you show me how you fulfill driving record requests? And the woman there said, oh, yeah, absolutely. I pull up my electronic system. The requests are here on the left. Takes me about an hour. I send it back. And I said, well, wait a minute. Where's the carbon copy paper come in? And she says, oh, my God, you were at child welfare. Those people live in the 19th century. Why won't they stop sending me this stupid carbon copy paper and email their requests like everybody else? So in about 2 hours, I was able to connect these two people, remove this carbon copy step entirely, which nobody wanted, and it shaved 32 days on average off their foster parent licensing process. And there are opportunities like that. There's so many of them. And especially if you go out and you talk, not just following the worker's perspective, but the family's perspective. We've, talked with tribal partners who revealed that they weren't able to get licensed because there was accidentally a requirement put in that they had to have county run recycling, which is not something that happens on reservations. So we removed that, working with departments of health to remove requirements for tuberculosis tests, which in the pandemic were particularly problematic for people to get, right? You had to take time off work, find transportation, go to a healthcare facility in a pandemic, pay for a test. And then even if you tested positive for tuberculosis, it wasn't disqualifying. So
you just had to have tested.
Yes.
I'm all for recycling, but I mean, come on, that shouldn't even be in there.
I agree.
I think you can foster and be a bad person for the climate and not recycle. That's unpopular opinion. But
yeah, we add a lot of policing to foster parent licensing. Dog registration is another great example. I don't care if your dog is registered or not, like that's between you and your county. We add too many things in there, and then we decide that says something about your moral character. And those things are super problematic and they need to be removed.
Yeah. I'm blanking on the guy's name, but we did a story. The between two silos thing kind of always made me think of this. His colleagues in LA called him the 2-click hick because he was a kind of a tech guy, knew his way around, but he was from Arkansas and he just worked for LA DCFS. There was some research being done in Los Angeles, I believe, that was trying to get at the connection between to what extent early childhood programs, in particular Head Start participation, helped keep, foster care from becoming necessary in cases where the families were known. Like the reason they picked LA, I think, was because this guy had seen like these two things don't talk to each other, but every one of these kids is eligible. So he just wrote like a very simple like thing where you click in, like once the caseworker saw it, they could be like Head Start. And then it was like, boom, they were enrolled, and it like just dramatically increased how many.
There's so many opportunities like that in well beyond child welfare. At the VA we found that half of veterans with PTSD were getting healthcare from VA, but not getting disability benefits for PTSD. And also the flip was true. We were paying disability to people that were not getting treatment for it. And a lot of that was like, hey, what if we add a checkbox on both these forms that if you're getting one, you don't have to, but you could be automatically enrolled in the other. And that really got uptick. I mean, there's so many nudges and little bits of behavioral science here that we could really use for good.
All right. So Child Welfare Playbook, give us the origin story here. How'd you guys come up with it? How long has it been going?
We're in 4 years of going on. We're at 21 states. You can check out the list on the website at childwelfareplaybook.com. It's just grown. Nobody's quit yet. So I think that's my main sign of
that's actually pretty good. Yeah.
Our success.
Yeah.
And the idea is fairly simple. Every month we have a different topic. As I mentioned earlier, it tends to be very specific. How do you use social media for kin finding, for example? I meet one-on-one with every state for, half an hour, depending on the topic. And then we get together at the end of the month and have a group meeting. And then every time we find or surface a promising practice from a state, we try to capture that in as reusable a format as possible and publish it on the website, always with the state's permission and clearance. Just want to note that.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there because I was wondering. Yeah. So you really come up with a topic every month for 4 years?
Yes.
A new one. Mm-hmm. And you talk individually to each state about each one and then have one communal member call?
Correct.
That's a lot of work. That's a lot.
It is, but it's a great way. I feel like you have to ask my states individually, but I think we have a good relationship. And it can be a safe place for problem solving. I tell people all the time, I'm not an auditor. I don't work for the feds. If you're struggling with something, my goal is to help connect you to a state that's doing something well. And the social media for kin finding is kind of an interesting one because we've got some places like Washington, D.C. that were just crushing it. And then places like next door in Virginia where social media was blocked. And so if you can pair up states, this is a chapter in the book too, but I really operate under the premise of going second. It's really risky in child welfare for someone to go first, no matter how seemingly innocuous or innocent a step is. And so this working group is a really great way to find someone has gone first on something everywhere. Or sometimes, even if they haven't, someone is usually willing to go first in some particular way. And if we can set that up, and then it makes it much, much, much easier for everybody else to go second. Part of that is a new functionality we added to the website called the progress dashboards. And it's the idea that how do you use the power of positive peer pressure to create change in child welfare across systems? And we designed it with states and with our members because they were like, look, we're tired of being on report cards and indexes and scores or being read. That doesn't feel good. It doesn't make me want to make change. And so the dashboards are very intentionally designed. They're orange, they're in alphabetical order. There's no red, green, or scores. And you can pop on for a different topic like kin finding or like how you fulfill Adam Walsh clearances, which is sort of a pet project of mine because I think it's full of inefficiencies that can be relatively easily removed. And look and say, oh, wait a minute, I'm one of 4 states that charges a notary fee. And then you can click through and get more information about why you would remove it. In that case being that it's really, really hard for one state to pay another state $10. So in practice, if your state charges like a $10 fee, the social worker is paying that out of their pocket or out of their office snack fund. And so when people learned that in a couple of states, they were like, oh, I had no idea. I thought it was just, a state to state transaction. Highlighting that kind of experience can help make an argument to remove it. We're not totally there yet across the whole country, but we've made a lot of progress that way.
Who gets to pick the topics? Do you have to do it every time?
I started, but the group is pretty good about suggesting them. And also some things are timely, whether it's we have a number of sub-projects that are running. So actually next year is going to be a particularly fun year, I think, for the group, because we're going to start doing a few months of more implementation and a little bit less of information gathering. And as we're running a sub-project or a subgroup on something, then we tend to try to line that up with the monthly topic so that even if a state isn't participating in a different project or they're busy or they're not interested in that topic that month, they can still come at the end of the month and listen in and learn something.
This seems particularly important as it relates to the Family First Act, which is just this huge enchilada that got dropped on states, not, over a course of years, but, now it's in everybody's court to implement it on all sides. And I'm sure I think there was an intentional vagueness about the rules around it. Like, I think they wanted to encourage states to kind of define things in a way that suited them. But I'm sure that's led to a lot of let's compare notes on what is actually going well and not, right?
Yes. And I think it's problematic when there's a central super prescriptive thing from the feds. And on the flip side, I don't know that states do really well with tremendous amounts of greenfield flexibility. I'm a big, big, big fan of reference implementations, which is like, hey, what if we let a couple of states or counties and a county administered that want to be leaders in this figure something out and then lay the framework of like, what could the key performance indicators be? What are ways we could achieve it? And then scale that out rather than leaving every system to kind of write its plan from scratch. I think that's where foster parent licensing got into a lot of trouble, where if you look at it, the authors of like the model foster home licensing standards, they meant for that report to be thoughtful, something for states to read and contemplate and then write custom licensing standards. And what states did was they copied and pasted. And that's how we ended up with things like recycling as requirements, was copying and pasting bullets without really thinking through them. And so I think I'd be excited around Family First to really see some implementation, some reference implementation sites as models.
So this is a group of people that are bureaucratic to some extent, right? The members are agencies. So the people that you are talking to every month are people in those agencies. How do you work, lived experience of people outside that bureaucracy into that network, the youth who experience care or the families that experience it?
Yeah, so that's, absolutely critical to any work, I think, is involving people with lived experience. So I have a team that works with me that do a series of discovery sprints. We have one going off about every 6 weeks that sit down at the families' tables or sit down and talk with youth on whatever that topic may be. And then we, at the very least, we reach out to the working group members and say, hey, which states would like to be involved on this topic this month? For example, like retention, right? Let's go out and talk to families that have been foster parents for 10 or 15 years and are still there. And then let's also talk to families that have dropped out recently or relatively recently and understand more about their experiences. So we solicit their participation across our states, and then we share that feedback back out. And to the extent possible, we provide really actionable steps to our members and try to publish it on the playbook of how they could act on it. A quick example there was a state we were working with that was really confused about why they had so many Spanish speaking, and I'm putting that in quotes, families. And then they would place a child in a Spanish speaking family, and the family did not speak Spanish. That was the mystery they were trying to solve. And so we did a very light bit of user research with some families that were filling out the foster parent application, because we had a hypothesis that ended up being correct. And it turns out when you ask someone that took high school Spanish, what languages do you speak on a form, they have a default behavior of checking the Spanish box.
Oh my God.
When we changed that question to, in which languages can you fluently communicate with a child, they do not answer Spanish. So we did some very light user testing with real families, fixed that question, and then shared that language back with all of our members. Now, as you know, it's not an overnight thing to change a state form, but that change specifically is slowly making its way across the country based on that bit of sitting down with really a handful of families and understanding more about why they were, people were like, well, they're lying. They weren't lying. They had a default behavior that was not helpful to the downstream system.
They do what people do when they apply for jobs.
Yes.
They make you seem yourself as marketable as possible. And
that's exactly the framing. And
pray to God, nobody ever asks.
Well, I don't think it occurred to them that would be the only check ever in the system as to whether or not, like, they thought maybe there'd be more of a conversation, and it ended up being that wasn't the case.
Yeah, no, I can see that. So the sort of the life cycle of an idea to be discussed by the group and put in the playbook, if I'm understanding you right, is like you conceive of something that's eventually going to be the monthly topic. And you have your team, like I think you used the term sprint, like you get out and do some recon on that outside of the sort of the member group, and actually, then take it to them, or
so it's opposite. So we'll pick a topic, say it's retention. Okay. We'll do a standard working group on that where I meet with each state one-on-one. And I mean, these folks in the working group, they know their topics really well. And so they'll talk through like, hey, we have this challenge or we have this hypothesis. Then I'll send the sprint group out because it just gives them a little bit more framing of kind of like where they might go, what state by state differences there are. And then they can report back. And sometimes we have ongoing sub-projects like the data-driven foster parent recruitment project we have with 7 states that's going into its 2nd year now. And that'll be something that we make available to all the members, but we just can't do that level of work with 20 states at once.
And how do you get access to, the young people and parents you need? Do you go through your members for that, or do you kind of have your own external connections?
It varies. We have, and we are a trauma-informed, consent-based. We pay everybody fairly that talks to us, just to highlight that. It depends on the topic, how we need to recruit them. For example, if we're talking informal kinship caregivers who are caring for kids that aren't in foster care, our members actually don't necessarily know who those families are, right? So we need to go back through community partners to recruit them. But if it's, for example, families that were around for 10 or more years and then dropped out, what we can do there is forward the invite to our members, and then they can forward that to the families. Yeah. And that way we have some data sharing agreements with some states, but that gives us the more flexibility that if the family is opting in, that covers everybody's privacy.
So I will post the link. Marina said it a couple of times, but in the show notes, you'll see a link to the playbook, which is really it's just a very super simple, easy to digest thing. I think the recommendations page is my favorite. And the first time I went to it, I was like, oh, alphabetical, why not by topic? But then your search function is good. You can type any word in and it pulls up, what you'd be interested in. But I'm just curious, there's tons of recommendations on there in this kind of searchable format, but have a few stood out to you as sort of eureka moments? Like, have you kind of surfaced something in one of these rounds where you're like, oh man, if we could just get every state on this? I suspect maybe the kin thing, but anything else?
Yeah, I think using social media for kin finding is a real game changer. I think adopting Oklahoma's policy around exceptions to licensing rules for kinship caregivers is a real game changer. Something that came up recently that was really eureka, because usually what happens is I have 1 or 2 states tell me that something is impossible, and it turns out everybody else is doing it. But this was a case where that was sort of flipped, where most states told me something was impossible, but it turned out we had 4 members that were doing it, was licensing kinship caregivers who do not have immigration paperwork. that was something I was told by many states was definitely illegal. And spoiler alert, it is definitely not. And there's certain ways that you want to do best practices around it, right? Because you don't want to expose that family to immigration, right? So there's steps to do it. But New Mexico did a great job of writing up and walking through how they were doing it in a really thoughtful way. And so they presented back to the group. And I don't think everybody has fixed it that way because there's some challenges around like, well, is it reimbursement? And there's some state by state details to work through. But that was a really cool meeting because I just saw everybody's eyes light up and everybody taking notes on the Zoom of like, ooh, wait a minute, this is something we wanted to do that we thought we couldn't do. I hear that a lot where people are like, oh, the model foster home licensing standards are federal law. They're not. They're a recommendation. You don't have to follow them.
Right.
And I think it's one thing for Marina to show up and tell you that. I'm not even a lawyer, but it's another thing if you're seeing 11 other, 10, 20 other states doing something. I think that's a different position that you can go back and say, ooh, actually, we're going to remove our tuberculosis test requirement too.
Yeah. Do you ever actually drag some federal folks in just to get on your Zoom and be like, just to be clear, you don't have to do this or...
We haven't done that yet, but I certainly wouldn't be opposed to it if that's the right solution. So far, this seeing from other states has been pretty effective.
Comprehensive Child Welfare Information Systems, the awful acronym CCWIS. Yeah. Okay, these are there's some money on the table for states. There has been for a while now to kind of gravitate towards the old 80s style systems of collecting information that we all use and getting it to a more modular state, something you can build on. Have you been following this? What are your thoughts in general on, the importance of the CCWIS and whether states are using this opportunity or not?
I've been following it. I think IT upgrades is always such a challenging pain point well beyond child welfare. I think it's something that states struggle with a lot. And this is a perfect example where if I was in charge for the day, I would have started with some reference implementations. Because if all we do is we take our SACWIS and we code it in a slightly different programming language, or we put it in, Salesforce or Dynamics or whatever, we didn't actually do anything. We didn't move any needles. We didn't fix anything for kin or for families or for children. What if, module by module, we really thought through, like, what are the goals we're trying to accomplish here? How are we measuring them? And let's almost compete as a country to accomplish those goals the best, right? And licensing would be a really easy example. And I know it's a place where a lot of people started on their CWIS journey. How are we licensing 80% of families in 60 days? How are we making sure that 100% of our kinship caregivers are licensed? And if you look at your IT modernization as an opportunity, like a Trojan horse for redoing your policy, practice, potentially law, forms, I think that's a really amazing opportunity to make your practice and your system work much, much, much better. And I don't see a lot of states doing that. I think they're really saying okay, take our SACWIS and, code it up in some new programming language. And I think that that's a waste of money in the sense that they're not going to get the value for the dollars spent.
I should ask you this since it's probably in your skill set to do it, but had you ever thought about building one, as a model? I had it in my back and I was like, I wonder if she'll just dump a good CCWIS on GitHub and just make it free for everybody or something.
Oh boy, that's an idea. I am not planning on getting into the CWIS game in that sense, but I am. Anything from our working group, for example, we make freely available. We have friendly relationships with all the major vendors, like our data-driven foster parent recruitment tools and our models we are giving away because we want that to exist in every state. Right. And we don't exactly want to maintain that for every state. Yeah, we are happy to give away, to give recommendations. But ultimately, if you sit down and you go through the silos, right? You look between the silos, you follow the process, you talk to your users, you co-design with your end users, your families, your kids. It's possible to design a really great CWIS, just waiting to see someone do that.
5 years from now, what is it going to be? 2027. What do you think looks fundamentally just completely different about the child welfare landscape? Not what you hope, what you think.
What I think, yeah. I think the way that we pay and resource kinship caregivers is going to change in the next 5 years. So I think that should be fundamentally different. And I also think that there will be some places that have started to crack the nut of prevention, data, and service supply. I think a big challenge in prevention is not only the data about who might need what help and what intervention early enough to prevent child welfare involvement, but also the supply of that. If someone needs housing and therapy, it's one thing to have the data to surface that early. That's step one. But then you actually have to have the housing and the therapy available, which is, I think, something that a lot of states, it makes them fearful about prevention work because they don't really want a list of things that they don't have. And I think that some places are going to start cracking the nut on that problem.
Marina Nitze, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Thanks to Marina Nitze for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always reach us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.